Welcome to Mayor Brown's Tech Talks podcast. Each podcast is designed to provide insights on legal issues relating to technology and IP transactions and keep you up to date on the latest trends in growth and innovation, digital transformation, IP and data monetization, and operational improvement by drawing on the perspectives of practitioners who have executed technology and IP transactions around the world. You can subscribe to the show on all major podcasting platforms. We hope you enjoy the program.
Hello and welcome to Tech Talks. Our topic today is navigating open source pitfalls in transactions. I'm your host, Julian DeBell. I'm a senior associate in Mayor Brown's technology and IP transactions practice. I'm joined today by my colleague, Paul Chandler. Paul is a partner in Mayor Brown's technology and IP transaction practice. But more than that, he is, for many of us in this practice group, the go-to person for open source software questions, the person we turn to whenever there is a particularly knotty open source software issue in a deal. So I'm really looking forward to this conversation today, and I guess I'd like to start by just asking you, Paul, how did you become interested in open source software?
Thank you, Julian. I started seeing open source in deals in the early 2000s. And at that time, it seemed like a bit of a niche. It definitely wasn't mainstream. And in part because open source wasn't widely used at that time. And there was even debate about how significant the legal issues were, given that this was free or no cost software. And there was then a lack of open source case law. But my interest in open source developed as we started to see it in an increasing number of tech deals, and clients asked for help analyzing licenses, developing open source policies, and negotiating contract terms for open source. And in particular, I was really intrigued by the complexity of open source licenses, which often involve an intricate mix of legal and technology questions. And that led me to look for ways to effectively mitigate open source risks for clients.
Okay, so you've touched on a lot of interesting elements here, and maybe before we dive in, we should unpack some of those and talk a little bit just about what open source software is, right? And there's no precise definition. Open source software is generally understood to refer, however, to both a software development model and a software licensing model. And as a development model, open source software refers to software created by crowdsourcing the work to a group of unpaid volunteer programmers organized into a project. The individual programmers contribute code to the overall project. And proponents say that this promotes innovation and collaboration among programmers, in part because it allows many eyes on the code to find bugs and add improvements. However, the development model is premised on the licensing model, right? Because for the licensing model, there are these two key features. First of all, open source software is software that's made available to the public over the internet in source code form, which is what allows this, ease of collaboration. And then the user is granted a license that permits modification and distribution without payment of any fee to the licensor, obviously removing a big speed bump in the way of, any kind of, spontaneous collaborative project. So you contrast this with most commercial software licenses that only permit use of software in executable compiled form with no access to the source code, and consequently prohibiting users from modifying or distributing the software, right? This open source model just removes all the obstacles to working with software and sounds, really very straightforward and simple. So, what are the risks here, Paul?
Well, it does sound simple. free software, and I say that in quotes, what could go wrong? It turns out open source is a lot more complicated than most people think. Let's talk about the risks. First, there are what I call garden variety risks. The software is downloaded from the internet for free without any of the typical licensee protections that you'd have in negotiated commercial software license agreement. For example, the software is as is without any IP infringement indemnity and no commitment for support or maintenance. All of those risks are borne by the user or by the company that employs the user. You could look to the open source project for ongoing support, but the project can shut down at any time and leave the code orphaned. So you need to get comfortable with those risks. But in addition to the garden variety risks, there are also risks that are unique to open source. These risks generally fall into two categories: license compliance and security vulnerabilities.
Okay. Well, again, lots to unpack there, but I mean, I think if you've heard anything about risks related to open source software, it's probably the license compliance risk, right? So let's talk about that first.
Sure. So free may mean no cost, but it doesn't mean you could do whatever you want. Open source software is not public domain software. There are license terms that users need to comply with, and there are many different open source licenses in circulation. So, what are the key things you need to remember? Well, first, open source licenses vary widely, but they generally fall into two groups: permissive and copyleft. And I think of this in terms of easy compliance and hard or more complicated compliance. Permissive open source licenses, such as the BSD or MIT license, are relatively simple. You can modify and distribute the code as much as you want, so long as you include notice of license conditions and attribution to the licensor. Notice and attribution. Copyleft licenses, such as the GNU public license, or called the GPL, on the other hand, require that if you distribute the code or any work based on the code, you must provide recipients the source code under the same copyleft license terms that you received that source code under, with the same requirement applying to all downstream recipients of the code or any work based on the code. And I just said the license will apply to distributed works based on the copyleft code, but what that means varies by license. The requirement that the license apply to or infest other software based on the code, is why these licenses are also sometimes referred to as viral. Uh, Proponents of copyleft licenses don't favor that moniker, by the way. As you can imagine, just to keep going with this metaphor, this infection can have major implications for companies. So, for example, depending on how you integrate open source copyleft code with your proprietary code, the license may require you to, one, distribute the source code for your proprietary code. Imagine that. Two, not charge a license fee or impose your own license terms for your proprietary code. And three, grant to the public a license to your entire software patent portfolio that might read on what you're distributing. These requirements typically get triggered by distributing open source code. However, it's not clear what that means
Mm.
in many cases. Many popular open source licenses do not define key terms or even specify what the governing law is. So that creates uncertainty about what compliance means. And even if you're not distributing the code, even if you're only using it in a SaaS or cloud hosted model, some open source licenses have triggered copyleft requirements based on that. And finally, the final point to remember is that some companies try to engineer their code to carefully avoid copyleft effects. But as we know, software evolves and changes as it's used, and those copyleft effects may get triggered later on down the line as the way the code is engineered changes.
Hmm. Okay, so a variety of different kinds of open source licenses, um, and they all have different terms, some more permissive, some less. So that gives you options. On the other hand, you may be using many of these together, and is it possible for the terms to be in conflict? Like, how would that happen, and what are the implications for the licensee?
Yeah, yeah, that's a big point. Yes, conflicts are possible, and it's another known risk. This happens when an application leverages multiple open source packages for the project, and the packages are covered by incompatible open source licenses. What do I mean by that? Well, remember I mentioned earlier that a common requirement of a permissive license is notice and attribution. But a common requirement of a copyleft license is that thou shalt impose no other license terms. So on the one hand, you have a license that says you must give notice and attribution. On the other hand, you have another license that says only its terms apply, and that's a conflict. And the important thing to remember is that this is incompatibility in the legal sense, not in the technical sense. The components in question may operate together just fine. And that means that the technical people, the programmers, developers, will not be aware necessarily of the conflict, but the legal department sure will if it looks into this. And you also need to keep in mind that this can be a multidimensional problem. What do I mean by that? Well, one dimension covers conflicts that occur between open source packages used in a project, the ones that the customer approves for developers to use. But it's also usually the case that open source packages themselves rely on other open source packages to operate. And those other open source packages can be referred to as dependencies. And those packages in turn have their own dependencies and open source packages that they rely on. So software license conflicts can arise from dependencies at any level within a package. And as you can imagine, this can get quite complicated. So what's the worst case? Well, the worst case here is that an open source license conflict will prevent the client from selling its product as it intended, or the client may incur substantial remediation costs to fix the problem down the road when it's discovered.
Well, so that's a pretty bad worst case, and we've just gotten through the licensing risks, and of course there are more, as you mentioned. So let's talk about some of those. Security vulnerability, I think you mentioned. What's going on there?
Well, security is a big item in the news these days. It seems like we're reading about hacks every day. There's a new system that's hacked, and there are a number of issues to consider. So, as you said earlier, the source code for open source is available for anyone to study, including hackers. Remember, Julian, you said earlier, many eyes on the code. So hackers may find security vulnerabilities. And for packages with wide adoption, that means hackers can exploit these vulnerabilities to engage in large scale cyber attacks. Also, Julian, like you said, open source is not just a licensing model, it's a development model. And that means that the model involves trusting complete strangers to make positive contributions to the software as it's developed. And anytime there's a need for trust in the digital world, there's an associated vulnerability. Open source is downloaded from the internet. Anyone can download the package, sabotage the files, and put them back on the internet for someone else to uh, download. And this can take many forms. Someone could switch the license terms. So, for example, replacing a copyleft license with a permissive license. And that would mean that the user wouldn't be complying with the right license terms. Another way this can come about is program developers can sabotage their own code. This isn't just a theoretical risk, it's happened repeatedly. We've seen people put malware into open source to protest, for example, Russia's invasion of the Ukraine. We've also seen the creator of a very popular open source package packages rather, Faker and Colors sabotage his own code because he became unhappy that corporations were using it for free. And then there's what's sometimes referred to as typo squatting. And
Mm.
here, a hacker downloads the code, injects malware into it, and puts it back on the internet for others to download, but with a slightly modified name to trick careless developers. So, for example, instead of a package called Julian.js with a capital J, it may be Julian.js with two L's or lowercase j.
Mm.
And of course, the hacker isn't just necessarily doing this once, it may create a multitude of packages with look-alike names to fool unsuspecting developers. This is a significant problem today, in part because we don't have the equivalent of an iTunes store for open source, where a central authority reviews and verifies what's available for download.
Mm. Okay, and yet, with all of these risks, scary as they may be, uh, open source software is not hardly confined to the margins of software production these days. It's mainstream. It's literally woven into the fabric of modern technology in our lives. I think a recent study found that something like 70% of software products were found to have pieces of open source software incorporated into them. Um, so, with all the risk, it's hard for businesses to resist the advantages of using open source software because those go straight to the bottom line, right? The low or no licensing costs, the basically free labor you get out of the community of programmers. And so, it's hard to resist. And so we see more and more deals where open source software is in the mix. So let's talk about those deals. How do open source software issues arise in the context of technology transactions? And maybe let me start by asking Paul, what kinds of deals are we talking about? Where are we most likely to see questions about open source software coming up?
Well, we see these issues to some extent in M&A and even in standard software licensing agreements. And standard, I mean commercial. But open source issues are usually implicated most directly in software development deals.
Mm-hmm.
A client will come to us and say, we want X software developed by Y developer for Z dollars. But just because there may be an agreement on price and scope, that doesn't mean you're done. And sometimes this happens in dramatic fashion. For example, we had a client whose business folks had agreed on price and general function for a large digital platform development, several hundreds of millions of dollars in costs. And they were quite surprised as the deal went on to find out that the developer planned to build the platform mostly out of no cost open source software. So naturally, there was a question with them, why are you charging me hundreds of millions of dollars?
So, as lawyers, then, how do we help our clients approach these deals?
Well, these days, almost every development deal we see involves open source to some degree. So we know it's going to be an issue even if the client doesn't initially mention it. Lawyers can best protect their clients by understanding the open source risks themselves and then educating their clients on the materiality of the issues and getting involved early in the deal formation process before open source selections become solidified. This is the lawyer's best chance to educate the client on open source risks before negotiations start. And in that way, it's less likely that these issues will be dropped in the heat of the battle.
Okay, yeah, important point. And in educating our client, as you suggest, what are the tendencies that you see that we need to be pushing back on and pushing them away from? Like, what are some of the most common open source software misconceptions and missteps that you have seen in your deals?
We see a number of misconceptions repeatedly come up, and go down a quick summary of them. One is, hey, it's free, there's no worries. The
Mm.
client looks only at the cost savings for the initial upfront cost, but not at the full cost of ownership. And by that, I mean the cost of license compliance, which can be a real headache, and also providing long-term support. The clients minimize the risk because they don't fully understand the risks, or they focus on the lack of open source litigation at this point, or they focus only on the particular software license, but not on code quality or the security vulnerabilities in the code. That's being too
Mm.
narrow-minded.
Hmm.
Or they think of open source in terms of a one size fits all solution. For instance, they might say, well, we've always dealt with open source this way. Uh, and they don't focus on what the particular project is intended to do, what its objectives are. And finally, we see a lot of clients that have the attitude of set it and forget it. They don't put in place some kind of ongoing monitoring of open source use as development progresses. And that leaves them open to risks because there wouldn't be any process to pick up new uses of open source or engineering changes that could impact license compliance issues, among other issues.
Okay, so how do we translate this into, actual legal advice? I mean, diving into the process of the deal itself, what questions do we need to start with?
We as lawyers need to understand what the client gets for its money. Is it getting custom code, open source, or something else? And in a development deal, preliminary due diligence is always key, but now it's even more so with open source. There is no one size fits all approach. You need to know what you're dealing with. And good questions bring out the issues, but they also allow you to avoid problems and propose appropriate legal terms or mitigating strategies. For example, while there are a lot of questions that could be asked, here are a few key ones. Why are we doing this? What is the purpose of the project? Is it to develop back office software, a product to be distributed? Is it a fee-based commercial product? Is intellectual property important? This is probably the most important question to ask because, as I mentioned, open source license requirements are more likely to be triggered by distributed software than those used for back office software, for instance. Another question is, where will the software be run? Is it internal? Will it be cloud-based, all or in part? Will it run on a third-party outsourcer's computers? How will it be maintained? What's the plan for it to be supported? And also, who are the parties involved? Does the client have a significant patent portfolio? Do each of the parties understand open source risks and issues? Is there sophistication there? Do they have open source policies with go and no go lists for licenses? The answers to these questions will let you find potential problems and look for solutions. For instance, there may be a different license that could be used, or you could switch to a different package, but you won't have the potential to find the solution if you don't know that the problem exists.
All right, so then diving into the negotiations themselves, what are the contractual approaches that customers should be considering for mitigating open source software risks in their software development agreements?
This is a really interesting area, and I'd say it's one of the most evolving aspects of open source legal work. Providers and customers are getting a lot better at understanding open source risks, but of course, the resulting contractual terms vary depending on the parties, the nature of the deal, and which party chooses the open source in question, in my experience. In the past, the customer would often say, absolutely no open source can be used on this project without my consent, or they might have simply forgotten or ignored the issue altogether. Similarly, providers often would say, any open source is provided as is. Our warranties and indemnities don't cover open source, and we're not including open source in our maintenance and support obligations. And now those positions are often not realistic, in part because open source is everywhere. And in many cases, the provider's competitors are giving protection. So I'd say these days, the terms in contracts regarding open source are much more nuanced to manage risk. There can be a pre-approved list of open source and uses, and I'd say more often than not, um, customary warranties of compliance and indemnities do not explicitly exclude open source software, but it really depends on the parties, on the deal, and depends on what's appropriate for the parties at the time. We're also seeing more uh, open source specific contractual provisions come into play. For instance, an obligation for the provider to provide information rights, like what open source packages are used, what versions, how they're used. And that is very important many times to facilitate the clients being able to comply with open source licenses that are relevant. And we talk to the customer and the provider as clients and look for what's appropriate in a given deal.
Okay, so you're talking about, Paul, getting into, our standard contractual provisions for managing risk, warranties, indemnities, et cetera. Are contractual solutions always just about those kinds of uh, risk allocation provisions? I mean, what else do you see?
It's not always the case. We've seen some pretty creative practical approaches to deal with open source issues. For example, we had a client that was trying to sell a software package that included copyleft open source. And in order to avoid an argument that our client distributed the copyleft code and with it all the integrated proprietary code, our client persuaded the buyer that it was in the interest of both parties for our client to transfer only the proprietary system code and let the buyer itself download the open source copyleft code and rebuild the product. And uh, and doing that also avoided an automatic grant of a patent license.
Hmm.
So there was skepticism at first, but when people understood the open source issues at hand, they were very in favor of a creative way to avoid them.
Yeah, that's a great point and shows the importance of both understanding the issues, and then thinking creatively about them. I want to come back to a topic you hinted at earlier, Paul, the question of provenance. Do you know where this software came from, and the risks that arise from that? I mean, that's becoming something of a hot topic, isn't it?
Yes, it's a hot topic and it's a deep topic. And the issue is twofold. First, you have the problem of making sure the open source packages were downloaded from the official project website, not just from the equivalent of an internet bulletin board. But even if the developer downloaded the open source from an authorized location, there's no guarantee that what was downloaded was the open source package the developer intended. Remember, we talked about typo squatting earlier and the risk of developers being tricked into downloading lookalike packages. And just like with license conflicts, this is a multi-dimensional problem. Mistakes and misdownloadings can occur with packages that the client approves for the project, but mistakes can also occur with open source packages at any level, all the way down the dependency chain. So, as you said, this is currently a hot topic, and companies are looking for ways to secure the software supply chain. There's also a drive to do this because of the recent executive order on software bill of materials, so called SBOMs. So we expect to see a lot of activity in this area as things evolve. So far, we're not seeing it come up in deals as much, aside from perhaps contracts that involve federal government agencies, uh, and aside from a general requirement for developers to provide SBOMs with their deliverables.
Paul, finally, I have to ask, how do you see the role of outside counsel in addressing open source software issues in connection with a deal? What can we do to help?
I think that's a really important question to understand how you can best utilize us or uh, outside counsel in general. So we can answer questions for clients and help clients educate their business clients and stakeholders in understanding open source issues. We can help analyze the proposed open source licenses for a client's project, identify and assess risks, and propose ways to mitigate those risks. For instance, depending on the project, mitigation might be not using the open source package in question for your project. That might mean that you use a commercial or a proprietary alternative instead. Or it might mean looking for an alternative license for the open source, or asking the developer of the open source, the project, for an exemption. Or it might mean engineering the project so that you don't distribute that particular open source. Or, as I alluded to earlier, we have the user download the package to avoid the issues. Many different ways. We can also propose contractual protections that appropriately allocate risk between the parties. And finally, when the contractual protections don't cover everything, we can identify and assess residual risks from the open source usage. For instance, the risk of typo squatting, dependencies in security vulnerabilities, and how to address those risks might be through monitoring and management of open source, use of open source policies, and coordinating with the company's security vulnerability policies, among others.
Oh, thank you, Paul. Great insights. Listeners, if you have any questions about today's episode or an idea for an episode you'd like to hear about anything related to technology and IP transactions and the law, please email us at techtransactions@mayorbrown.com. Thanks for listening.
We hope you enjoyed this program. You can subscribe on all major podcasting platforms. To learn about other Mayor Brown audio programming, visit mayorbrown.com/podcasts. Thanks for listening.